Ever feel like elections are like, okay, which shiny promise do I pick? Like, it's tough to tell what's real, you know?
Yeah, totally. We're drowning in info, right?
Exactly. So that's what we're doing here, diving deep into this 2024 election. We've got candidate A and candidate B's plans, and we're going beyond the surface.
Getting into the nitty-gritty.
Right. What do these plans actually mean for, like, everyday life? They've both laid out their ideas on the economy, social stuff, and security, but their approaches are kind of different.
For sure. And that's what makes it so interesting, right?
Totally. So let's jump right into it, starting with the economy. Candidate A is pushing this $6,000 tax cut for new parents. They say it'll help working families, and it sounds good, right? Putting money back in people's pockets.
Yeah.
But what's the bigger picture?
It's really interesting, actually, because it sounds straightforward, but it's more nuanced. It's actually building on that child tax credit thing we already have, the one that gives you up to $2,000 per kid.
Oh, yeah, right.
So it's not just an extra $6,000. It's like they're reshaping the whole system.
So a revamp, not just a quick tax break. What does that mean for families? Would everyone get the same amount?
No, that's where the details matter.
Right.
That $6,000, probably the max, and it'll depend on how much you make. Think like a sliding scale, like the current system, right? Higher earners might get less, or even nothing.
Makes sense. It's always in the fine print. So how does this compare to candidate B? What's their take on taxes and helping families?
They're all about making those recent tax cuts permanent, including the expanded child tax credit stuff set to expire. They're arguing that steady, predictable help is better than one big bump.
So A wants a big splash, and B is thinking long-term.
You got it. And there's a deeper difference here, too. Candidate A's plan seems to be saying government can fix things, help families directly. Candidate B, with the permanent cuts, is more like, let's step back, let the economy grow, and lift everyone up.
Wow. Okay. So it's about how much the government should be involved, too. Quick cash versus a slow and steady approach. Two different visions, huh?
Exactly. And that's key for voters to see. It's not just about the policy itself, but what it tells you about their whole economic approach.
This is giving me a lot to think about, and we're just getting started. Okay, so let's switch gears to another hot topic this election: energy. Candidate B keeps saying they want to unleash American energy, which I don't know about you, but it sounds kind of vague. What's the deal with that?
Yeah, it's a catchy phrase, right? But it's loaded. Basically, they're talking about ramping up energy production here in the U.S., especially those traditional sources.
Like oil and gas.
Exactly. More drilling, maybe opening up federal lands. They're also big on nuclear power. The idea is become energy independent again.
Okay, so sticking with what we know, which is a stark contrast to candidate A, who's all about clean energy. What's their plan actually look like, though?
It's a big shift. They want to move us away from fossil fuels completely and build a clean energy economy. We're talking major investments in things like solar and wind power, plus a ton of money for researching even newer clean energy tech.
Sounds expensive.
It's a long-term play. They argue it'll create jobs, boost manufacturing, and eventually lower energy costs for everyone.
So two very different paths. But on a practical level, like, will people actually see a difference in their energy bills?
Right, that's the million-dollar question. Candidate B says more American oil and gas means lower prices. They think if we produce more here, we rely less on other countries, and that protects us from those global price spikes.
Which we've definitely seen lately with everything going on. But is it really that simple?
It's more complicated than that. Global energy demand is a much bigger factor in prices. Even if we drill more here, things happening in other countries can still cause prices to go up.
So no guarantees of cheaper gas, even with candidate B's plan. What about the environmental impact, though? Candidate A is all about tackling climate change, right?
Definitely. Their whole plan is built around that, moving to clean energy as fast as possible. They're looking at the science. And to them, it's not just about the environment, but also the economic opportunities in clean energy.
Which candidate B doesn't seem as concerned about, at least when it comes to fossil fuels. Do they even address climate change?
They acknowledge it, but they see it as something to manage, not a crisis needing drastic action right now. They're more about technological solutions and less about government intervention.
So, not outright denial, but a different sense of urgency. And this ties into economics and even foreign policy, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Candidate B's focus on energy independence, it suggests they see American energy as a bargaining chip on the world stage. Like, we could become a major energy exporter rivaling countries like, say, Russia or Saudi Arabia.
Wow, energy as a geopolitical tool. This is getting really interesting. But all this talk of clean energy investments, it makes you wonder, how would candidate A pay for it all, especially with those tax cuts we talked about earlier? All right, let's dive into our final big topic for today, immigration. Candidate B's talk about the largest deportation operation in U.S. history. That's gotten a lot of attention, and for good reason. It's a strong statement, but what does it actually mean in practice?
It definitely packs a punch, doesn't it? It brings up some strong emotions, and it makes you think about those big deportation campaigns of the past. But to really get it, we got to look beyond just the words and think about the history of all this. The U.S. has always had a back and forth with deportation. It seems to shift with whatever's going on in politics or the economy at the time.
So, knowing the history helps us understand what's happening now. What can you tell us about those past deportation campaigns? What was their impact?
Well, there were times when things got really intense. Like back in the 1930s, during the Depression, there were these huge roundups and deportations of Mexican immigrants. Even some U.S. citizens who were of Mexican descent got caught up in it.
Wow.
Yeah, it was rough. And a lot of it was driven by the bad economy and, frankly, some really discriminatory policies. Families were torn apart, communities were devastated. It left a real mark.
It's a dark part of our history. How does what candidate B is proposing compare to all of that?
It's hard to say for sure without seeing their plan in detail, but using that phrase, largest deportation operation, it does seem like they're hinting at a return to those big enforcement actions. And they keep talking about securing the border, the wall, more border patrol.
Right.
So, yeah, it seems likely they're thinking about more deportations, potentially even more than we've seen in recent times.
So, a pretty big increase in enforcement. Now, candidate A has got a completely different take on immigration, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
They're all about creating a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants who are already here.
Yeah.
Especially the dreamers, those brought here as kids. Their argument is those folks have grown up here. This is their home. They deserve a way to stay legally.
So candidate A is all about creating a more welcoming system, while candidate B is focusing on stricter enforcement. Two very different approaches, and it speaks to how they see the U.S.'s place in the world, too.
Exactly. Candidate A is coming from this idea of America as a nation of immigrants, a place of refuge and opportunity. Candidate B's leaning more toward putting America's interests first, national security, and having tighter control over who gets to be here.
It's like we've seen with all these topics, whether it's the economy, energy, or now immigration. These aren't just policy debates. They're about values, about the kind of country we want to be.
I think you've hit the nail on the head there. It's about the bigger picture, the values behind the policies. Do we want a more inclusive world, or do we prioritize ourselves above all else? Those are some big questions this election is forcing us to think about.
It's been eye-opening to dig into all this with you, to really understand what's at stake. We've talked about tax cuts, clean energy, immigration reform, and one thing's for sure. There's a lot riding on this election. This isn't just theoretical. These policies have real consequences, and they'll shape the country for a long time.
I agree. That's why it's more important than ever for everyone to get involved, to go beyond the slogans and really understand what each candidate stands for. It's not always easy, but the more informed we are, the better choices we can make about our future.
Well said. To everyone listening, keep researching, keep asking those tough questions, and most importantly, get out there and vote. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.